Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Rebel City Podcast. This week we are talking with Douglas Stuart, author of Shuggie Bain. This has been the latest in a recent series of books that we've covered, mostly because in isolation and furlough I've been reading books. This book is phenomenal. I don't think, and I'll say this through the episode a number of times, that I've never personally sort of resonated with a book that spoke to the time and place that I grew up than this book. 80s and 90s Glasgow, poverty, addiction, trauma, but also hope, alongside the violence and the struggles that the people of Glasgow had in those times. Douglas really beautifully captures what makes Glasgow special and how its people stand up and remain hopeful and remain, together in these sort of tough times. I couldn't recommend it highly enough, and I really hope you enjoy this episode. Cheers, guys.
So hello and welcome to another episode of Rebel City Podcast. This week's guest, we're very, very privileged to have Douglas Stuart. How's it going, Douglas?
It's going great. Thanks for having me, you guys.
Not at all, man. It's really nice to meet you.
Absolutely. What time is it in New York?
Right now it's 10 o'clock in the morning. So I've been up for a couple of hours writing, and now I'm talking to you guys at home.
Excellent. It's a good start to the day. Well, hopefully it is anyway. So, generally speaking, as we get started, we kind of usually just throw open the first couple of minutes just to let the guests kind of introduce themselves in their own terms. So, I don't know if you maybe want to just take a wee minute to say hello and let folk know who you are, etc.
Oh yeah, that's a big question, right?
No, it's a bit like first day in a new job, isn't it? Like,
exactly. I'm a Gemini. I like long walks on the beach, that kind of thing. No, I mean, I'm Douglas Stuart. I'm sort of talking to everybody right now about my debut novel, Shuggie Bain, which was published just back in August. It was actually published in February in the States. But I'm Glaswegian. I was born and raised in Sighthill and then all throughout the East End. I went to secondary school down in Pollock at Crookie Castle. But for the past 20 years, I fell in love with an American. So for the past 20 years, I've been living in New York. So that's almost half my life now. But I was working on Shuggie. I am a knitter by trade, funnily enough. I got a degree in textiles, which is super dead gay and also dead Scottish. And so I'm a knitter by trade. But I started writing Shuggie 10 years ago and sort of working on that book in that way because I'd always wanted to be a writer as a kid, and we can probably talk about that a bit more later. But it's just been sort of a long road, and I didn't write Shuggie with any like great expectations of it or any sort of desire to get it published. Truly, honestly, I wrote it for myself, and I wrote it just as this portrait of the Bain family, who are this working class family in Glasgow in the 1980s, and who are sort of coming apart as the city around them is starting to come apart. I am the queer son of a single mother. And my mum, even from my earliest memories, really suffered with a drink. And then when I was still a kid, she died of it one day. And so I think a lot of sort of what I was writing about or trying to sort of put on the page was to write about Glasgow from a slightly more feminine perspective, which sounds weird because I'm a man. But obviously, there's such a huge literary canon of West of Scotland giants. But I'd always sort of been in a part of a world that was about mothers and single mothers and women suffering with addiction. And then being gay myself, sort of felt very isolated from other men in a way. That wasn't an easy thing to be in the early 80s. It wasn't super accepted. But anyway, so that's who I am and where I'm at. But I don't know if that covers it.
No, absolutely. I mean, we do have a few questions as we go about, the women of Glasgow, because that is something that really does jump out at you. And it was something that, looking at it as a male writer, it was quite surprising because I don't really have a lot of memories of, extremely well-written women by men, if you follow me. So it was something that really resonated with me, and we'll touch on as we go through it. You can answer my first question, was that was to kind of say to you, if you were going to throw a percentage on it, how much of this would you say was autobiographical? But I think, you've kind of covered that already. So,
the only thing I would say about it, Matt, is it's definitely drawn from real life, but I wouldn't ever present it as a memoir. It's a work of fiction.
Yeah.
When I started writing the book, it really quick, like I sort of wrote it from the feelings of what does it mean to be poor and to love someone who's suffering with addiction. But almost within the first couple of chapters, it's dwarfed anything I could ever know about both the characters and the time and the place. You'll know that the book sort of spans, I think, about 30 years and even goes back to the 40s. And so there was no way I could write it as a memoir or even just look at what a sort of 8-year-old boy would know about the world, because actually I didn't even find Shuggie, even though he's the heart of the book, the most sort of compelling perspective. I wanted to hear about all these characters. And part of that also is how you are, or how you want to write about a working class story, because everything you go through is a collective experience. I felt as a kid, I never really felt it was something that just I went through by myself or my family went through. I knew everybody was going through either a tough time and the way you sort of share those. And so that really quickly just meant it could never ever be a memoir.
Of course. I mean, it's not your first foray into writing, but the book am I right in saying you've written previously for the New Yorker, and you've had other sort of creative endeavours as well. So I was quite interested to see what it was that drew you to the novel format, having been a success in other sort of creative disciplines. Yeah,
actually, the novel was the first thing I wrote. I'd been writing sort of for myself in secret for many years. And it wasn't really it didn't need to go anywhere. It didn't need to be shared with anyone. I just found huge amounts of comfort in just writing these scenes or these vignettes. But the novel Shuggie was the very first thing I wrote. The short stories, I had 2 short stories in the New Yorker this year, but I wrote them after I wrote Shuggie, and they're not related to the book, but they're kind of like in the constellation of the book. I think even though, Glasgow still is such a formative part of me, I don't think you can grow up in a city that's as empathetic and loving and compassionate, but also challenging and a bit dangerous and a bit sort of oppressive at times, and have that not sort of form your psyche as a writer. And so these other stories sort of come from that. But, I was working in fashion. I mean, I live in New York. I was working for some big American brands, but I'd always wanted to be a writer as a boy. But my education was so disrupted by what was going on in the neighborhood around me, by sort of what was happening in Pollock at the time, by my mother's addiction, by just a lot of things, just the pressing needs of life, I suppose. And so by the time it came to sort of choose a path in life, it was just seen as something like boys like me couldn't do. And so instead I was sort of sent into textiles, which was great, because here's not an academic thing, but it's very artistic and it's a trade-based thing. And in 1992, Scottish textiles were still on their feet. They weren't yet on their knees, like a lot of trades. They are now. I mean, they're not in a great position today. But
yeah,
I went into textiles, and that was a great thing. But really, writing was about sort of furloughed dreams for me and trying to sort of come back around to it.
Amazing.
I mean, I spent years playing music, and I remember having a conversation with my dad where he actually tried to talk me into taking a management position at McDonald's. Yeah. Other than like pursuing my dreams of like playing music for a living. Do you think that's something that's kind of like prevalent in working class communities, this sort of defeatist attitude of like, no, maybe you should go down the route of the McDonald's management position rather than playing your guitar in your room? Like, that seems like, no, put that down, don't do that. Do you think that we're kind of like almost like hamstrung before we even begin if you want to be a creative from like a working class background?
Yeah, I definitely think that's true. But I think it's also sometimes done with their best intentions at heart. I think certainly for me, they wanted me to succeed. Here was a kid who didn't have any parents, who at 16 was sort of, I have siblings, but you can't anchor your whole life around your brother and sister. And so I had to go out and find my way in the world. And so the teachers were trying to like turn me towards something. But you're totally right. And I mean, I just read Deborah Orr's Motherwell last week, which is a fantastic book if you've not read it yet. But here's Deborah Orr that went on to be this huge academic who went to be on this Guardian, this journalist that ran the Guardian in London. And her mum and dad, she wanted to go to St Andrews University, and her mum and dad were constantly telling her to lower expectations. Not because I don't think they didn't believe in her ability, but because they wanted her to you know, we live in such a realistic city, and, you know, we're faced with realism all the time. And so they didn't want her, I think, to be disappointed. And then she was sort of dissecting that phrase, you know, what's for you won't go by you. And we use it 100 times a day as Glaswegians.
That's my dad's catchphrase, swear to God.
I can't even think, if I had a £1 coin for every time somebody said it to me, you know, and it's, in a way, it's meant to be like a good thing, right? It's meant to be like, don't worry too much about it. If it's meant to be, it'll be. But she was like, actually, what I take from it is don't sort of aspire for better, because if it's, you know, it's kind of like a limiting thing. And that's like a weird thing to have as almost as a national phrase, you know? And so you've got to, but I think you're right.
It should probably be emblazoned in Latin underneath the lion rampant or something like that.
Above Kelvin Hall, yeah, exactly.
So I think we'll probably just move a wee bit onto the book, because we have covered a few books recently. It's been an absolutely brilliant year for Scottish literature. We actually, for once, we've been chasing the First Minister a bit in terms of our book recommendations, but I was actually reading Shuggie before Nicola Sturgeon this time, so we got ahead of the trend on this one, so we did. I think the first thing that struck me, and when I was talking with Paul prior to this today, like the imagery of the book, being from Glasgow, still in Glasgow ourselves, like we've been here as the city has kind of modernised to a certain degree, and a lot of things that are looked at, you know, critically in the book have changed in a lot of extents. But the imagery was something that it actually took me back really sort of viscerally to the Glasgow of my youth. I think when I was reading the scene where they're taking the taxi by the Royal Infirmary, when Shug Senior's in the chip shop, talking about the flat, and when Agnes is out sunbathing. I mean, I used to walk by the Sighthill flats back and forth for town regularly, and there was times when I genuinely felt like I was like a nosy neighbour, kind of like earwigging in on stuff that was going on about me rather than actually reading something. Just how familiar it was, and it brought back memories that I just had let go of. This older Glasgow. The first one I kind of wanted to touch on was that I get the impression, and you did mention it earlier on as well, was that you seem to remember Glasgow as quite a violent place, even up to and including like multiple instances of like sexual violence. But you've still somehow managed to like convey a level of warmth and affection in the writing, and like it's got to be a pretty like tightrope to walk. I mean, how do you even go about conveying the horrors alongside the actual beauties of the city? Like, where do you start with that?
You know, I wouldn't say that I like had a big plan at the very beginning of it. All I wanted to do was write a really intimate story. I didn't even intend to write a political story or a story about poverty or about the change of the city. I just started with a nucleus of that family. But growing up poor and in the East End, I knew a lot of violence. I mean, and I think when your mother is suffering with drink, excuse me, I think when women are especially violent, especially vulnerable, then they're really sort of vulnerable to violence. And so I grew up seeing a lot of it. And excuse me, I really sort of, life for me was all about sort of, I think when you don't have a lot of money, you don't necessarily get to control all of your experience, and things sort of happen very much cheek by jowl. I always knew the sort of the saddest moments to actually be the funniest moments. You know, it's that phrase, you know, a Glasgow funeral's a better time than an Edinburgh wedding, that sort of thing. And that some of that is part of the Glaswegian spirit. But I also then knew sometimes the most sort of violent moments to be the most intimate, because you have to almost bring whatever warmth or whatever love or whatever sort of hope you have sometimes to a situation and place it right in the center of it. And so it was always that sort of juxtaposition. What I knew I didn't want to write about was just to write about violence on its own, or about sadness on its own, or any of these emotions, because sometimes I don't feel like they're worth very much in isolation. When they get really interesting is when they're butted up against other things that sort of contrast it. So, you know, when we look at these really peaceful moments in the book and these moments of hope, there is an ominous thing that's sort of swirling above it. And then even within the darkest moments, there is this sort of like very faint flicker of hope. And I like that sort of contrast between them. And I just knew that to be life. You know, you have to kind of like plow on with what's ahead of you. And And I found as a kid, some of the saddest times were also the funniest. You know, and I think that's the Glaswegian spirit sometimes.
I can definitely agree with that. I mean, in terms of reading through the book, I mean, I've got to be honest with you. I struggle to think of a time where I've sort of personally connected with a book as much as I have with this one. I know we've had other great Scottish books along, you know, even like The Young Team, you know, there's stuff that was relevant to our lives and that maybe Paul and I are, you know, 10 years beyond now. Trainspotting, again, has loads of stuff that as a Scot you can relate to, but again, that Edinburgh setting had a level of removal for us. Whereas with Shuggie Bain, like, this is both when and where, like, Paul and I grew up. The biggest one that jumped out for me in terms of like where it was then to where it is now is the sort of Catholic Protestant divide. Okay, now this is something that I like because it's prominent in terms of it's there throughout the book. It's part of the general sort of conversations that go on, but nobody ever really explains, you know, why it is how it is in the book, and that kind of resonated with me because when I grew up, I lived in a city where a large proportion it was othered to me, but nobody ever really sat down and explained to me why. Now, with all the like sort of myriad of stuff that's in the book, why was it important to include this?
And that's a brilliant question. And actually, it was important for me to include it in a way where I didn't explain it to people that didn't grow up in the city. I get asked that a lot in the States especially, you know, what is it? Tell me about it. And I thought to myself, well, I wasn't really writing it for an American audience. I was writing it for people who understood it and who'd lived through it. But sectarianism was a part of my life. I came from a mixed religion family, Catholic mother, Protestant father. And so sometimes, you know, my grandparents didn't go to my mum's wedding because they were very staunchly Catholic. And this is in, you know, the 60s. And so they just didn't go to their only daughter's wedding. And this is like a really telling sort of indictment on where people are. And so sectarianism, or at least sort of the divide between Catholic and Protestant, was a daily part of my life. And even later, growing up in the East End, I grew up in an East End, in a house and estate that was predominantly Protestant. But then I would have to go, you know, chuck bottles, chuck bricks, fight across the Royston Bridge to the people on the other side. But then I would be going home to a Catholic mother, you know? And so it almost didn't even make sense. There was a senselessness to it too. But the Orange March and the Big Lambeg Drum were a part of my childhood. And I just wanted to put it there as a note, almost like a strata of the city that is a part of everybody's sort of daily existence. But I found that when I wrote the book, I knew what it felt like and I knew how it would make people feel. Like I knew how it made the characters feel. But then I didn't actually understand the origins of sectarianism. And I think that's also fundamentally quite Glaswegian as well, right? You just live with it, but you don't ever like get to go back and look at the sort of the Irish immigration or the Reformation, or like really study it and really understand what sort of Catholic immigrants did to the unions at the turn of the 20th century. And so I found I had to go back and like, you know, I knew I could describe it perfectly, but I didn't know why it was. And I found a lot of that in Glasgow, not just about sectarianism, but a lot of things that we do in our life. We just accept it as what's in front of us, you know, and this is how it is here.
Yeah. What type of reaction do you get when you try and explain the Glaswegian sectarian divide to people in America? I'd be quite interested to hear, because we must be one of the only cities on the planet that's got such a massive Irish Catholic presence that doesn't celebrate St. Patrick's Day, for instance. We're not allowed to have open St. Patrick's Day parades, whereas in New York, it's a massive event, like it's huge. So, yeah, what type of response do you get? Is it just like disbelief?
It's total disbelief. But then what I found, and I couldn't figure out why it was, and I thought it was actually the Scottish outlook, was we don't really tell our own story overseas very well. So they weren't very aware of like sort of sectarianism at all. But then also the tough time that Glasgow went through in the 80s, they didn't have any idea that unemployment went up into the 20%, that people were really struggling. And I think part of that is, we don't like to talk about poverty or a tough time. We're a very stoic people, and you know we don't believe in exceptionalism. You're not exceptionally great, but then you're also not exceptionally hard done to. Because everybody's got a sad story. And so when I talk to audiences out here, they had no idea that the city went through such a tough time, or that it goes through sort of sectarianism, or that happens. But they do have a very clear reference for Northern Ireland out here. And so when I say, you know, if you imagine that Glasgow has the second biggest Orange Walk after Belfast, that sort of starts to sort of pin it for them and give them a bit of a sort of context. But I find that our story, I don't know what it is, it's not very well known around the world. Our collective story.
Yeah.
I think that's something that we're seeing a lot of just in general just now, is like people start to really share the stories of their cities and countries as we get that information online, and people really start to speak, especially in the mental health side of things. It's like we need to start talking about these things. And I think even when I speak to people in the podcast or just outside podcast, and we talk about what went on in the schemes, a lot of the violence, the sexual violence, the having to watch your back on a daily basis. You would get mugged if you didn't take care, if you didn't watch out. People are just like, did that really happen? It's almost like a sort of stereotype that people are like, I don't think that was real. It's just something that people just sort of play on, but it was absolutely real when I was growing up anyway, for sure.
Absolutely.
Totally. And I think, like, I didn't realize it at the time when I was writing the book, but I think, like you say about sort of mental illness and things like that, I was just writing the book, and through writing it, I was sort of healing in a weird way. It was hard to look at a lot of trauma, and whether it was violence or addiction or misogyny or homophobia, whatever it was. But by the end of it, I felt sort of like, at least I've been sort of honest and I've been able to put something on the page. And I think it does come along with that thing. As a kid, I never got to, you would never let anybody know you didn't have much in the house, and pride is a big theme in the book, about how Agnes as a character doesn't ever sort of like take her poverty or her addiction outside the house. She always is done up in her hair and her coat, and she's dressed her best. But then you would never tell anybody you had a parent suffering at home. That was a shameful thing as well. And especially as a son of a mother, you would never, the last thing I think any boy would ever do was say something bad about their mother, because it's just something we're conditioned as young men never ever to do. And so there was a lot of sort of hiding things as a kid for me. And so in writing the book and just being honest about poverty, being about, my struggling mother, about all these other things was healing. And I think it's only recently we are allowed to talk about things. Obviously, addiction has roots in mental health issues. It has roots in poverty. And so it's only recently we can face up to that stuff.
Yeah. I think as well, was when you're saying it was quite difficult and kind of like cathartic to kind of go through. Like on the other side of the coin, like, I was saying to you prior to starting to record, like I'm literally in Germiston right now, where Agnes was born. Like I can see the gas towers. My granddad used to walk me around them in my pram when I was away. Like I come from where she comes from. I grew up in a household with parents who drank excessively, without ever really, they were functional. There was never any of the issues that Shuggie faced in the book, thankfully. But again, this was how people in their day and that time essentially self-medicated in a lot of respects. Yeah. Like it was quite given the resonance for me, it was quite difficult to read in a lot of places, not in the sense that I wasn't enjoying it. It's a beautifully written book, but like how real and how close to the Glasgow that we grew up in made it like emotionally quite difficult to get through in places. Like, is that something that has come up elsewhere, or is it just something that maybe our closeness to it is bringing out in us?
Aye, that's exactly it. I think everybody's got a sort of different lens of it, and now it's sort of in the hands of the readers in a way, and it's people bring their own perspective to the book, and some people sort of see it just as absolute fiction and they can't even imagine the world and it's just a million miles away. And then there are people like you and I, and a lot of people I know that have a sort of personal relationship with the subject matter. And so it's just been sort of, I think because I honestly didn't think the book was going to be published. And when I sent it out, when my agent sent it out for publication, it was rejected 32 times before a publisher, somebody brave stepped forward and said, we'll publish this. And so, but they didn't know how to market it, was one of the reasons given behind it. They just didn't know, especially here in the States, because I live here, they didn't know who the audience was for a Scottish book about what was going on in Glasgow in the 80s. But it's not really just about that. It's about love, and it's about hope, and it's about how children sort of rally around flawed parents, and it's about, women having their dreams dashed and not having options, because it's about a lot of things that are universal.
Of course.
But I only wrote it I just tried to be as honest as possible, because I honestly never thought it'd see the light of day.
You feel like that maybe gave you, because we've spoke a lot with guys like James Allen for Las Vegas, Graham Armstrong himself spoke to one of our friends, Kevin O'Reilly, who's a composer and a musician, about like how the sort of thinking mind can just kind of get in the way of your creativity, that like flow state is this sort of ideal way of like producing art or producing creative projects. But do you think because you never thought that it would see the light of day, that really you were writing it for yourself, that gave you a lot of room to just really let it flow out rather than getting caught in thinking, I wonder what people think of this, is this going to be too harsh for people? Or do you feel like it was like a real organic sort of process for you?
Totally was. And actually it took a while to get started on it, because I kept feeling sort of like it wasn't very good, and I was feeling sort of, I had an imposter syndrome, and why am I writing, who am I to be writing anything? But probably about a year into, or 6 months, maybe not as much as a year, it just started. I found I couldn't stop it. But at the same time, I did something where I never ever imagined it would be a book. I never allowed myself to think I'm going to have something that was finished. And the book actually came, or what became a book, came out in sort of chapters that weren't in chronological order. So actually, the very first chapter I wrote is in the middle of the book. It's chapter 13. It's Shuggie with his big brother Leek, and they're going over the Sea of Slag. And then I wrote the next chapter, maybe it was 7, then I wrote 24, and then I took it as it came to me, and I wrote it as, I didn't want to resist it, right? So you're talking about flow state, and I just didn't want to get in the way of it and try and mold it into a thing that I never knew it was ever going to be. And so when I did that, when I gave the book power over me rather than try to have power over it, it came actually pretty quickly and pretty easily. And the first draft was, I tell everybody this, it's true, was 900 pages single-spaced. And the book you've got in your hand, for comparison, is about 450 pages double-spaced. So the first thing, there was like so much about Glasgow that I wanted to write about. Every single character had an arc, and even the chorus of characters like Ginty or Eugene had a backstory and a consequence, and we're bringing something to the social moment. And so I just got out of the way of the book and just wrote what I saw.
Mm-hmm.
That's cool. I mean, the notion of chorus was actually something that I picked up on when I was putting questions together. We'll start, because it was about how, again, women and the Glaswegian women are really prominent in it. But I think we'll maybe just start with Agnes at the minute, if you don't mind. Like, I think it would be probably quite fair, as you say, to maybe even say that Agnes is, at least in parts, the main protagonist of the story, even though it's named for sort of young Shuggie. And you've used the term sort of flawed. She was deeply flawed. And again, it's almost, again, word for word exactly what I've got here, which is quite telling. I kind of seen a similarity between Agnes and the way you've portrayed Glasgow, in the sense that she is someone who has a lot of troubles in terms of drinking, in terms of relationships, and obviously, kids that kind of want away for and over time eventually escape. But she's also presented in a really sort of sympathetic way in the book that I really, and again, growing up in a house of drinkers, having had issues with drink myself, like, I found her so sympathetic. I don't know how that comes for this flow state that you talk about, like, where how do you naturally make such a complex character, both, negative in terms of their characterization, but also, sort of positive and sort of likable. I don't see how it can be done unless it's actually deliberate, you know what I mean? So when you talk about that flow state, it seems almost impossible to me in that respect. Like, what was the motivation when you were writing Agnes? Where does she come from?
Well, I never saw, we often talk about Agnes as an alcoholic, and I never ever saw her as an alcoholic. I saw her alcoholism as a state that a person was in. And so before she's that, she's a mother, she's a woman that grows up in the 50s and 60s when, she probably didn't stick around in education. She thought getting married would be a good thing to do for her own sort of sexual advancement, and also because, being a wife and a mother and having a house and raising a family was sort of what was an option for women in those times, for Glaswegian working class women. I was reading even Deborah Orr in it when she went to university in 1980. Only 0.003% of university students were from the manual classes, she called it. And so that's just not even on the radar for Agnes. But then as the 70s and the 80s come in, and you start to see sort of feminism gain a rise and women starting to take more control or have more options in life, it's also a bad place for characters like Agnes and other mothers like that to be, because the poverty just doesn't allow them that. It's too late to, I had a conversation with an American publisher here who was like, be great if she went to like evening school and sort of went and got a law degree and all of that. And I thought, well, you just don't understand the time of the book at all.
Gentrifying your story.
And I'm like, this is not a place that this book can be published. Like, you just don't understand it. She can't have an Erin Brockovich moment because that's just not something that mammies in the 80s had access to.
No.
So the reason why I could write Agnes and all the characters in that way is even when they were suffering with drink, I tried to remember them as a whole human being. And Agnes is, she's a beautiful woman. She has, at the beginning of the book, she's seen as having these really exhausting wants. But it's not that she wants too much. It's that the world around her isn't giving her enough, She wants very realistic things. She wants her own home with a front door, council house no less. She doesn't ask for a big private house. She wants, clothes that she can buy for her kids without getting them from a catalogue. She wants a husband that adores her. She wants maybe a couple of holidays at the caravan a year. She doesn't want much. She wants very realistic things. But still, the world can't provide that for her. And but she's a full person before she comes to the drink. She's beautiful. She's proud. She's industrious. She's funny. She's generous. She's got a really lovely circle of women friends that she has a big menage party with up in the Sighthill Towers. And then she's also flawed and know very well. And, so I just always tried to think of her as a full person. But I think writing a 900-page first draft allowed me to love everybody first. And even people that are really bad bastards, like Big Shug is unlovable, I think. But actually, I tried to love him, right? I tried to think of him as this Masonic guy who was, everyone says he philanders his way across the city, but actually he doesn't. He's shagging and he's treating women atrociously. Philandering's far too nice of a word, but I just tried to love them before I put them on the page, because I thought if I didn't love them, then I would manipulate them in a way, and I wanted not to manipulate them that way. I don't know if that makes sense.
It makes complete sense to me as well, because as we've spoke to people about like adverse childhood experiences, how like we're moving past that sort of alky junkie stereotype, more into what's happened to these people, what are the experiences, so we can understand and prevent this for future generations of people. And that's like amazing that you've managed to sort of encapsulate that, not just like in the book, but also in the way that you've tried to like write the characters. So who read the audiobook?
Angus King read the audiobook.
Because he called it Menage. And every time he said it, I burst out laughing, because I was just like, it's Menage. Like no Menage.
I don't know, maybe it's from the East Coast. We'll let him away with it. No, it's the Menage.
Aye, definitely. Sorry, I had this.
No, that's brilliant.
So in terms of the other woman, like obviously we've touched on Agnes, and we'll go back through some of the rest of it as we go. I felt like a real, like just general reverence for Glasgow woman in the book as I was reading through it. We have young Shuggie's pals in chapter 1 talking to him, and we then have, as you say, the sort of catalogue and card party up in the high flats where they're all exchanging their bras, and there really is a sense of like community. And then as it goes on, as they show up in the sort of pit scheme, there's this, and this is where the notion of chorus came in, because it was almost, as she met all these women in the pit scheme, it was almost like some sort of Greek theatrical chorus that she'd sort of run into. And it's not something that's really reflected in the sort of men of the book. Like, as you say, Shuggie Senior is just a mad shagger, and he is quite hard to like. Agnes's first husband feels almost a bit kind of like a bit a passenger in his own life in a lot of respects, and like none of the men in the book seem to have the same level of community that the women in the book often experience, even though sometimes that experience is negative. What is it you're trying to say about Glasgow women? What is it you want people to take away about the woman of Glasgow in the book?
I think well, first of all, my entire world was women, so I was just drawn to that in that way, meaning like my life was with a single mother. Even the AA characters that would come around the house were all women. And there was a lot of single mothers, right? There was a lot of women who were done with their marriages by the 80s and didn't have anywhere else to go. And so they were raising their wains on their own. And so that was just a universe for me in my own personal experience. And then also my rejection by other boys and men, you know. By about the time I'm 6 or 7, boys just decide I'm too effeminate, I'm too poofy, and they just don't want to sort of play with me. And so all my friends were girls, and just my entire Glasgow experience was girls. But then I keep reading all these Glaswegian books, and it's about hard men and detectives, and, you know, even Agnes Owens, who's a female writer, writes about Mac, who's a man. And so I never really sort of saw that world that I actually knew reflected. And I thought if I started to write about sort of constellations of men in a way, really quickly you could write, I mean, obviously you can write so many books about that. Miners striking, ranks of taxi drivers, all this thing. But it's been done, and it's maybe been done by better writers than me. And so what I wanted to do was just really keep the lens on women and what they do. And even Shuggie's experience when he, you know, even Shuggie, who is suffering with with his mother having addiction at home, we keep coming out and seeing these other girls who are suffering the same thing with addiction, whether it's the character of Annie or the character of Leanne, because it's also a reminder that there is this sort of underground network of a lot of kids who were going through the exact same thing, and a lot of parents, it's just you didn't always see them because we kept it at home. But I've always known women to be the strength of Glasgow, and that sounds like a glib, like a bumper sticker thing to say, but it's true. I mean, I've always known them to hold their wains together, to like go out and sort of make a better future for everybody. And it was a tough time. Glasgow was a patriarchy, right? We sort of anchored everything, at least when I was a kid, around the Friday night wage packet, around football on weekend, around drinking at the weekend. And so in a lot of ways, women were sort of buffeted around by that. But I never knew that. I just knew them to be strong in their own right. And to survive under that is like remarkable. And so how would I not want to write about that?
Absolutely. I mean, it's another one of the parts of the book that really resonated with me, because I grew up, down in Hag Hill with a gran and 6 aunties who all had 2.4 children each. And, my gran's house was this communal place that was entirely dominated by women. And that was one house of several hundred on Walter Street that were in the exact same boat. So I think it's something that really rings true in terms of that perspective. And I think because we don't see it an awful lot in Glasgow literature, like it really sort of jumps out and is something that I really enjoyed about the book.
Yeah.
Why do you think Glaswegian women put up with so much shit, right? Because like I think about my granny. She had, like my dad used to say, she had tons like shovels. So if she hit you, like your head was spinning, like for sure. But they put up with the guy going to the pub on Friday night and coming back with half his wage packet on the Saturday. But why did they do that? Like, why did they know, like, put the foot down like they did with their kids? Like, these were really, like Matt was saying, sort of like really strong women that put up with so much stuff, like violence as well as like poverty. Sometimes it was their man's fault that they were living in poverty, because he would go, like we're saying, I remember my dad coming home at midnight on a Friday night and screaming up the stairs for my mum to come down and like almost carry him up the stairs when I was like really young. But why do you think they put up with it? Why did they not just like kick back?
I think I mean, that's a big question. It's a brilliant question. I think it was all about sort of the options they saw outside of it. I think we didn't allow women in that time to think they could have a life of their own, neither sexually nor economically nor sort of hobby-wise, even just in a sort of in a different way. And so a lot of the women in the book that I write about sort of, they go into like having a home and having a family and having a husband that they marry, because that's sort of what they saw their own mammies do. That's what society will allow them to do, and when we're talking about what people thought about me as a young man, and I'm a man. And so imagine that sort of like multiplied 100 times, the pressure on what we must have thought about young girls at the time and what should be open to them and what they can do in life. It must have been buckling. And so then when sort of society starts to fail a wee bit in the 80s, and you've got all these single mothers and really fierce grannies and all these women that have put up with men all these years, it must have been a terrifying time, and like a really sort of, I think one of the things that I learned from a kid was there was so many women that thought, why the fuck did I put up with that? Like, why did I like hitch my wagon to this man that wasn't worth very much, and then the sort of the tide comes out and they're left alone with it. And so that was like, I think that must be a terrible reckoning in life, right? To sort of, you know, it's a terrible thing even when you put your entire fate in someone that you marry. Even as a man, I'm married to another man, but I would never dream of putting my entire like life in his hands. I've got to be a person on my own. I've got to go out and get fulfilled. And I don't think we allowed women to do that. I think they put all of their fates and all of their lives and all of their, you know, waiting for a wage packet to come into the house, even if they had wee jobs, in a man. And then imagine like living like that. That must have been terrible for them.
I would think so as well, to be honest with you. Like,
and then for the bastard to lift his horn to you as well after all that, do you know what I mean?
Yeah. And actually, I was reading the Deborah Orr thing, and like, I was reading, it's a beautiful book if you've not read Motherwell, because it is written from a woman's perspective about, it's a play on the word Motherwell, the town, and then mothering well, right?
Yeah.
Even there's a scene in that where like Deborah's mother just says to her, you know, you're expected to have sex with your husband even if you don't want to. Like, it's just something you've got to do. And Deborah can't like wrap her mind around it. She's like, what do you mean? Like, where's my sexual fulfillment? Where's my wants? And she's like, no, it's not like that. Just do it, sort of thing. And even when I write about sexual violence in the book, I wrote about it in a way that sort of, there is no recourse for someone like Agnes to say, oh, wait a minute, I didn't want my husband to do that to me. I didn't want that, because the truth is there was an obligation there, right? And I always remember hearing about that as a kid, just sort of mother's joking. And it was kind of like, it was a very sad joke, but it was because there was a lot of truth in it, but just like, oh, I got to get him off my back, so I'll have to have sex with him and do all this. And there was like a thing in that. And to hear Deborah Orr reinforce that was really sad.
Yeah, definitely. I think you also touched on, you know, your husband there. One of the things that, and again, try to be really careful not to talk about too much of the plot of the book, because we want obviously people to go out and read it. But
go and buy it.
There was one of the really beautiful like bits of writing in the book for me was when Shuggie kind of like quote unquote got his first dolls, and it was the Tenants girls, and it kind of painted both how Shuggie was different, but also what Agnes was going through. I mean, it is a very, very different time now in Glasgow and everywhere in that respect. But like, obviously, I'm assuming that you took some of this for your own personal experience growing up in Glasgow as, you know, that queer, different sort of thing. Yeah. Like, what was that like? Because I mean, it's so different now that it's an almost alien concept. When I read back, I was like, you know what? I do remember how difficult it was for people at school, people in the scheme who were in any way, shape or form different, never mind whether it was sexuality or anything else. Like, what was, I mean, I don't know if I'm framing this right, but I mean, what was it like for you in that respect? Why was it important to include it in the book? Yeah,
it was really important to include it in the book, because I also didn't want it to be a story about just us looking at Agnes feeling isolation. It's not just about this mother feeling alone. I wanted them both to be a sort of unit that are sort of marooned together, that sort of like highlights then the love that sort of they share. They're each other's only sort of solace, right? Yeah. But growing up gay, first of all, I have to say, I think there's people that grew up gay in Glasgow in the 80s and had a great time. I think they probably all lived out the West End, and I think they had it was all right for them. But you know, on the East End, it wasn't that great. And then I also have to just say, I think there's probably still people growing up gay in Glasgow that are having a terrible time now. We tend to, certainly in the queer community, think that progress is even and progress hits everywhere, and because we see it on telly and we see it in pop music, that everybody's having a great time. But I live in New York, and one of the biggest charities I support here is about kids that are turfed out of home by their parents when they're discovered they're queer. And there's far too many kids that are suffering for that in the most liberal city on earth. So I know there's still people in Glasgow suffering, I have to say that. But in the same way I wanted to write Shuggie, I was more sort of worried about writing Shuggie in a way, because I didn't want him to be seen as just a gay person or a gay character. Because actually, in the same way as Agnes, everybody is a whole person, right? This is just a facet of who you are. And like, the other thing about writing about Shuggie is I was going to sort of like, at the beginning, think about it in sort of explaining it in very grand terms. But I always knew homophobia is quite direct. It was just, why do you want to be like a wee woman? Why are you effeminate? Why are you poofy? And then you would get slapped for it. It was never sort of like wrapped in sort of like religious dogma or like, you know, you're going against God and are you going against Christ? It's like, It was about violence from one man to another man. And even actually sometimes women were the most homophobic people I'd ever known. But it was just about sort of, it's almost misogyny by another name, right? Why would you want to be this little feminine thing? And so you would just get slapped for it. So it was a lonely thing for me as a kid. It was scary a lot because there was a lot of violence that came with it. And it was also something I could never get out from underneath. You know, when you grow up in a scheme, as soon as something's perceived about you or it's your business, then you never, 12 years, 14 years, it'll stick with you the whole time. Like there's no reinventing yourself if you can't like move away. And that's a lot about what the book's about as well, right? Agnes and Shuggie are on this sort of pit scheme, and they can't like get out from under what other people expect and think of them. And that's, we know that to be true.
Definitely.
Is that what you did yourself? Do you feel like that you left Glasgow to reinvent yourself, to get away from like the stigma?
I think so, a wee bit. I think I was just so untethered. Meaning, like, after your parents die and you're a young man, like, what is holding you anywhere? And so there wasn't anything, and Glasgow never let me rest as a kid. It never, I couldn't play football. I couldn't sort of drink with the boys on a Friday. So there was no place for it in me. And then also sort of growing up gay, the saddest thing for me, actually, that happened to me as a kid was after I left Glasgow, I had kids that I went to school with that would like reach out to me and be like, I was gay as well. And so there was not even any, and I'd known them for like 6 years, 12 years, whatever it was. And being in class, and they'd seen me maybe getting slapped about or lamped, and there was no way that they could ever sort of like accept themselves or say me too. And it just wasn't a place for that. It was all about otherness in the 80s, in all kinds of ways, and you just weren't allowed to be the other or else you were isolated.
Yeah. Something that we're getting dangerously close to in just general society at the minute as well, to be honest with you. Something I think that we should learn the lesson for the 80s and 90s and actually be more conscious of the fact that we don't other people, but unfortunately, it doesn't seem to be the world that we're living in at the minute, to be honest with you.
Yeah. Me and Matt were talking about this before you joined the call, that like, try and think of a question about like the parallels between Glasgow or just the working communities of the 80s, like Sheffield, Glasgow, Motherwell being a big one as well, where when they deindustrialised, they seen this aftermath of poverty and violence and addiction, and we're creeping back towards that. It seems to be that the violence in 2020 seems to go in the way where we're seeing a lot of suicide, but just wondering what your thoughts are on that as we like sort of do come out, like go back towards that sort of horrible age. Do you know what I mean?
Aye. The state of the economy leaves us at serious risk of going back to that time again, I think, in some respects.
Oh, totally. And I think we have to not leave men behind. I think oftentimes when I talk about the book, I'm expected to sort of talk about these are things that men did to women or to gay kids or that heterosexuals did to straight people. And at the end of the day, I think our society is often set up where we hurt men first and then men sort of pass that hurt on to everyone else. And, a big part of like writing the book for me was therapy, like I said, because I had no way to express or let my feelings out other than through my creativity. And I'm grateful for my creativity. But I grew up in a time where men were expected to be a very narrow way. You had to be masculine, you had to be hard, you had to be hard first if hardness was needed, you had to hit people before they hit you. And not every man's like that. And so when we don't allow like a full spectrum of masculinity or, and we're not even talking about sexuality, we're just talking about like men being allowed to be different types of men. Even books were like a really risky thing for me as a kid. Even to say that I wanted to study English is a weird word to say on the streets of the East End of Glasgow. And so, so we have to first of all acknowledge the damage we do to men in order to like then stop the damage we do to women and to kids. It's not a thing that exists in isolation. So I can understand why men turn to suicide in huge numbers. I can understand that. And I can also understand how we kind of feel like we're leaving them behind in society, because we do tend to blame men, because I think a lot of it starts there, but then we blame them without offering help. Something you had said earlier was interesting, because we a lot of time there's a lot of pressure on working class writers to tell a story in a particular way. Like as a middle class narrative, you can write about anything. You can write about wee boys being taken in by the priesthood and then sold into sexual slavery. You can write about women being used as wombs. You can write about women being locked in basements. And you're never sort of condemned for writing about the ugliness of the world because it's seen as fiction. But when you're writing about a working class narrative, there's a burden placed on you to tell a really happy or a positive story or to uplift a whole class. And the truth is, it's hard enough just to write a story. So to then have like all these other burdens on it is unfair, and is a way we sort of penalise working class writers.
Yeah, I think this is something I actually seen quite recently on Twitter. I don't know if some of the actual local or the sort of authors that live in Scotland still, I'm pretty sure somebody tagged you in it as a joke, where somebody had made a comment about, can we have a Glasgow novel that's no about misery and poverty and blah, blah, blah. And it leans directly into that, what you're saying, where there's an expectation, like grittiness or whatever it happens to be, that I think we should be able to move beyond now. So excuse me.
True too, but then my answer to that is that guy should feel totally free to write any book he wants to write, and he should stop telling everybody else what they can and can't.
What they can. He's no gatekeeping here. One of the other things, as we've touched on, obviously Agnes, the women, the men in the book, and Shuggie. Shuggie's siblings was one of the things that I kind of wanted to touch on briefly, just as I think we're heading towards sort of wrapping up. It feels as though, having done a wee tiny bit of reading about yourself, that the three siblings are almost some sort of like approximation towards your own experience, where obviously Shuggie covers the sort of queer element of your personality. Leek is very artistic, and the sister is somebody who kind of emigrates and goes elsewhere. And it's parts of your own sort of personal story that I found, again, quite similar there. Is that fair? Is that something that was done deliberately? Is it?
I think as a writer, you always start with what you know and then see where it takes you. You're always drawn from your own life, even if it is lived experience or not. The only thing I would say is I definitely have really supportive siblings, but the characters in the book are not reflective of them at all. In fact, in a lot of ways, the character of Leek, the brother, who is this sort of very artistic, creative boy, but he's older than Shuggie, and he's offered to go into Glasgow School of Art, and he sort of turns down that offer to get away because he can't leave his brother with his mother and is just too worried about them. So stays at home, brings in a YTS wage to sort of like keep them both on their feet. And in a funny way, he's almost the ghost of Christmas future of myself. I think as a kid that grows up with an addictive parent and a parent that suffered from addiction, I'm always, you're always wondering about the paths you never took. And, I ultimately never got a choice because my mother died of her addiction. But I often reflect on, well, if she hadn't, I'd still be by her side. I'd still be in Glasgow. There's no way I could have believed I would ever have left this woman because I loved her so much. Yeah. And so Leaking Away is me writing that sort of consequence, right? It's about me writing what happens if you sort of put your own life to the side in order to save somebody else. And that's the story of the book, right? How far will you go to save the person you love the most before you have to save yourself? And that's what you see all three of the siblings have to reckon with.
Yeah. Brilliant. I think we'll cover the elephant in the room. Obviously, you started out with a book that you said was for yourself. We've got through it. It's dynamite. But we're not the only people that seem to have picked up on it. You're now nominated for several very prestigious sort of writing awards. Is that something you could have ever expected?
No, I could never have expected that. I'm so grateful for it. I mean, I'd be lying to you if I said that doesn't feel brilliant, because it's such a powerful thing. But I never expected it. There's no way to sort of even think that way. I was so excited just to have a book published, and then it was published in February, and then the pandemic hit 2 weeks later. And for a debut novelist, everything just swallows, right? Nobody can see you, nobody can find you. And so I was kind of grieving in a wee way. I was sort of just accepting what was happening and sort of trying to get on with my life. And so, I'm as surprised as anybody to be on these lists, but I'm so grateful for it because it just helps the book find readers. I think that's the real power of it.
Do you feel like it's a sort of vindication of the process? Because, as you say, you had 32 knockbacks before anybody decided they had a means to publish it. As you say, you've walked straight into a global pandemic when other publishers already had doubts about how they were going to promote it anyway. And it's up there as potentially one of the books of the year.
I tried to think about it in a wee bit more personal terms. I think it's a really nice accolade, and it sort of makes gold out of trauma in a way. I think about my mother losing her life. I think about all the women that I grew up with who lost themselves to addiction, and I think of it more in those terms. I think to be recognised for the Booker in that way is some kind of silver lining to all these rain clouds, and so that's what I try to sort of focus on.
I think that's a really beautiful way to look at the contribution they made to your life.
I think so, and it wasn't like they were ever voiceless, because by God, could these women roar? You could hear them from the other side of the screen. But we didn't like to listen. That's the real truth, and especially when women are failing in that way, we have a really tough time as society of sort of like facing it. And mothers are meant to be infallible, and that's just not a realistic expectation. And so the book for me, the MBA for me, I hope is just a wee bit to say, look at what this is, and and hopefully whatever they're watching from, they can take a wee bit of joy in that.
Mm-hmm. Brilliant. That's awesome, man. How are you finding it second time round? So normally at the end we'll do a bit of what's next, and you were saying that you were writing, so you starting your second novel, or is it more shorts for like the New York Times? Or
yeah, actually I'm really pleased to say that my second novel, I think you're going to be hearing about pretty quick. It's another book. It's going to be set a bit later in Glasgow, but it's going to be this big sort of hopefully a sweeping gay love story set on the house and schemes of the East End. Two boys that are separated by sectarian territorial gang lines, and I'm just excited. I think as a writer, I just always want to write about love and connection and trying to find a sense of belonging. So I do believe I'll be able to tell you more about it in about a month's time.
Wow!
Oh, amazing, man! And how's that process went? Well,
process. Funnily enough, this, I actually had written a lot. The book right now has the title of Lock Off, and it's I'd written most of it before I'd even signed for Shuggie. So when I tell you I'm writing for myself and I was doing all of this in isolation, it is true. And so by the time Shuggie sort of attached to a publisher, I'd almost written most of Lock On. So I'm ploughing on with some other things on the far side, thinking about book number 3 and all of that. But Lock On still, for me, I don't know how people will perceive it or take to it, but for me, it still has that sort of written in isolation feeling. I did it for myself. So,
I think it sounds really interesting in the same kind of sense where Shuggie has looked at women from a different perspective to other sort of more traditional Glasgow novels, like a gay love story across the sectarian divide in Glasgow is something that I would definitely be interested in reading. So best of luck with it.
Oh, thanks very much. Yeah, I was thinking about, when I was writing it, I was thinking about like the pressure we put on boys to man up. We talked about like the narrowness and what we expect men to be, and what happens when you've got a gentle or a sensitive boy that just isn't in his nature, and yet we expect sometimes this sort of like intense violence from him, or this intense masculinity. And so that's just what I had wanted to do. But also in writing Shuggie, we leave Shuggie on the brink of manhood. Shuggie never sort of expresses his own sexual desire or his own romantic desires, because his entire love is his mother. And so I was left sort of feeling like, now I just want to write about what it means to be a true young man in Glasgow at that time. And so that's where the book came from.
I'm definitely in. You've sold me on it.
For sure.
Cheers.
Douglas, thanks very much for your time, mate. It's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you, man. The books, I mean, I had a moment walking along the Kelvin walkway at 6 a.m. It was pitch black, where I literally like had tears in my eyes just listening to the book and just thinking back to every character in the book just brung somebody real for me into my mind for the past. And I think that's why it's been such a success. And I think that when you said there about like a book about like sectarian divided gay relationship, I was thinking there's going to be so many people that will be loving that story and be waiting for that type of story in this city and beyond, where it's been almost like restricted or taboo for them to even like just live their life. So I can't wait for that, man. But congratulations on Shuggie, and congratulations on all the awards, because it's well deserved. It's a fantastic book, and I hope everybody that listens to this goes and buys it or downloads it and listens to it, whatever way that they want to consume it. But yeah, thanks very much.
It's been echo that, like, we've been on a wee sort of book trajectory in recent months, and this is something that, you know, we've looked at and talked to some great authors, and like you're in totally comfortable company. Like the book is something that is just, I said earlier on, I've never resonated personally with a book the way I have with this one. And I really hope that your success continues to grow, and we see Mary again. We're welcome back anytime, man.
Oh, thank you so much, guys. It's been brilliant to talk to you today. I've been stuck here for the past 8 months, so I'm feeling heavy homesick. So as soon as I'm back, let's have a pint. But thank you.
Aye. Excellent.
Sure. Thanks very much, Douglas. Cheers.
Lightning falls when there is panic in the sky. Thunder calls when all but fear is left to die. You tell it like it's fantasy, something that you're never going to be. Same old story every day. There's just one thing that I have to say, that if we believe, if we trusted you, then I don't know why you say the things you do. You'd see a whole new way to be, giving honest answers and not those lies to me. Empty halls now filled with echoes of their past. Honor stalls, they lived each day like it's their last. You tell it like it's fantasy, something that you're never going to be. Same old story every day. There's just one thing that I have to say, that if we believe, if we trusted you, then I don't know why you say the things you do. You'd see a whole new way to be, giving honest answers and not those lies to me. And I can tell that you're on a mission just to break the walls down time and time again. If it wasn't true, would it be okay to break the walls down time and time again? That if we believe, if we trusted you, then I don't know why you say the things you do. You'd see a whole new way to be, giving honest answers and not those lies to me. Believe, if we trusted you, then I don't know why you say the things you do. You'd see a whole new way to be, giving honest answers and not those lies to me.